has reduced the burnt offering on the altar and placed them beside the altar. He shall then take off his vestments and put on other vestments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning and not to go out. Every morning the priest shall feed wood to it, lay out the burnt offering on it, and turn into smoke the fat parts of the offerings of well-being, as a perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar, shall not go out. All right. So what I find really interesting is, I don't know if we mentioned this last week or not, but the Hebrew does not really have a word for it or him. It uses the similar word. It's pretty much interchangeable, which provides us a basis for implying that when one leans their hand upon the animal being offered up, they become the animal. The Hebrew word here represents a male or female person. It's like a neutral subject, it. Based on the laying on of hands, the subject in question now represents a person, right? So according to Leviticus 6:1, the Olah offering is supposed to burn all night long until morning, and the flames of the altar the flames of the altar should burn within him/it, so it as a person. So we're going to kind of come back to this talking point. So I just want to kind of put that idea. Okay, so I have a quick question. Where does the fire on the altar come from? You guys can answer that, if you know.
Well, it's always there, isn't it?
Right, but it came from somewhere. It was who lit the fire?
Hashem lit fire.
Hashem.
Exactly. So it's a Hashem, and then it becomes a permanent fire. So cool. So that's an important point. So obviously it comes from God. So he's the one who lights this fire. Therefore, it has physical and spiritual values. It's part of God himself, right? So when someone burns upon the altar, drawing near to God, what remains, or the leftover result of that, is important. Thus, the language used in the Torah for describing the process of removing the ashes is important. It's an important lesson for our lives, I would say every day. So the ashes are what remains of the service which was performed the previous day. So it went from yesterday all night burning on the altar, and when the priest comes in, that's what's left. So before we start a new day and a new service, we must build on the work we did yesterday. We have to take the inspiration from what we did yesterday before we start working anew. So the priest has to undergo a special procedure of dressing and undressing from his garments before he can complete this task. However, the wording used here is particular, so let's break it down and see what its inner meaning could be, right? So Leviticus chapter 6 verse 3 says, "The priest shall put on his fitted tunic." The word here, and I believe the slides are up, the second word, mem dalit, a measure, a cloth garment, there, that's for your reference, can mean garment or cloth. It can also mean stature or size. And then the next word in this passage is the word bad, not like bad as in evil bad, but it's bet dalit with the patach underneath, makes the word bad. So this can mean white or linen. However, it has the same meaning of separation or isolation. So if you translate the word literally, it says, he gathers in separation to put on his flesh. So something of that effect. So it could literally read, the priest shall put on his measured linen garments to isolate his flesh. And just a quick, I'm using the word isolate a lot here, but it's no COVID related thing, just in case someone thought that's...
I feel like you did this on purpose.
It is just a genuine coincidence. All right, so... However, the word bad, as we saw in Hebrew, is used in the New Testament and the Torah itself for a seclusive type of prayer or meditation. So an example of how the English would translate this word, because we don't really find those words in the English version of the Gospel or even the Torah too much. So this would be why. So it's usually translated something like, for example, in Matthew 14:23, Yeshua went off to pray alone or drew aside. But it uses that word bet dalet there, bad, for isolation or withdrawing. So it describes Yeshua going off in the mountains to be alone after having spent time with people. So this was a normal thing for the sages of Israel to do. It wasn't an uncommon thing. It wasn't like, this is just a common practice. And unlike the state of our faith today, there was more of a tradition of mindful meditation. It wasn't a taboo thing because it was just part and parcel of your faith. There was no, is this idolatry? Are we talking like Zen Buddhism here? That never crossed their minds because they knew the source of where it came from and they knew how to differentiate between the two. So obviously when we say mindfulness and meditation, it's not the meditation as we know it today. Rather, it should be thought of as controlled thinking. In reality, it's mastery over the heart. That's what we're looking at here. So controlling what thoughts enter our mind so we may focus solely upon Hashem, His Torah, and upon Yeshua. So having entered the state of separation on his flesh, or going back to the high priest now, having measured himself, he dresses in his seclusive garments. Then he raises the ashes of yesterday and puts them next to the altar before he takes the rest to a place of purity outside the camp. After this, we read that the fire must not stop burning within the Olah offering. The Torah says literally within it, not upon it, but within it, within the altar and within the Olah itself. The fire has to burn inside that person. The priest must kindle this ascension offering every morning before feeding trees, etzim, it says in Hebrew, or wood, upon the altar, then offering up the fats of the peace offering. Now, as we've discovered, the heavenly temple is a similar reflection of the earthly one, right? So one being a copy of the other. So therefore, we can assume allegorically, if Yeshua is the Kohen HaGadol of heaven, then he must be doing a similar action. So as we saw last week, he brings an offering from among us to awaken us, as stated in the verse, when a man among you brings, referring to the Mashiach, or the heavenly Adam, bringing the korban to the altar in heaven. So he also keeps the fire burning upon the altar of our hearts, yet it is up to us to feed it and not let the flames die out. So we should use trees, or rather a tree in particular, that is the tree of life, or the Torah, to feed that flame. Now here's an interesting little commentary by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So he says that the altar is like a person's heart, but reminds us that the fire from heaven did not fall until 7 days of consecration to atone for the trace of the sin of the golden calf. Then he asks, why did the fire from heaven require earthly perfection, right? God could, and he did, just bring fire, but why did they have to do this 7 days of consecration with fire? Like, what does that mean? Well, because man is infinite and there are limits to what we can achieve on our own. What we do is bound by time. For our actions to be eternal, we require a divine intervention. Hence the tabernacle was set up and taken down during the 7 days of consecration. Because as a work of man, it could not be lasting. There's a time when it will come down and we'll have to build it up again. On the 8th day, the fire did come down and it made it an eternal fire. But now we're charged with feeding that eternal fire. There's still, even though it's from God and it has eternal qualities, we still have to have some kind of maintenance into it. We can still let the flames die down or even become just like embers. No matter how small they are, that we could lose the glory of the flame or that is within us as a living sacrifice. We have to keep that fanned and alive. Okay, so that's that part. Now I want to come back to the beginning where we're told that the high priest needed to put on a garment of separation on his flesh. So this special garment, as we learned, is more than just a physical clothing by the use of the word badad, or bad in Hebrew, meaning separation or isolation. So the writers of the apostolic epistles and letters tell us that we should be practicing something similar, right? So the goal of one who serves at the altar, which is the heart as we learn, is to separate us from our flesh. So before we go and do something like pray, which is the equivalent of a sacrifice, perform a mitzvah, we have to isolate certain thoughts and behaviors and attributes, right? So we're going to use the same ideas found in this Torah portion. We're going to look at dressing and isolating or separating ourselves from our flesh. For example, Romans 13, chapter 13, verse 13 to 14. If someone could look that up, that would be really helpful. If not, I can find it.
Could you say the verse again, please?
Romans chapter 13, verses 13 to 14.
Sorry, what verse again?
13 to 14 of the 13th chapter of Romans. I have it here if no one has it.
No, I got it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Let us live properly as people do in the daylight, not partying and getting drunk, not engaging in sexual immorality and other excesses, not quarreling and being jealous. Instead, clothe ourselves in the Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, and don't waste your time thinking about how to provide for the sinful desires of your old nature.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. So, so mine says, I think you read it the same. Instead, clothe yourself with the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. That's interesting because there's clothing that the high priest wears and it's put on by another Messiah figure upon him. And so that is its own kind of image. But the concept is we have to put something on and not engage in something. So we're kind of looking at Yeshua as a type of mental garment, or even though there's actions to it, this mentality, this persona, right? Okay. So this kind of gives us the key for our boundaries around the meditation, where we can kind of start and end with it. We are to dress ourselves in the Messiah, the person, and wear him like a garment. It's like something we put on every morning, kind of like carry a cross every morning, but it's a little bit more in depth here. Okay, so how we do this is by looking at two different techniques for analyzing ourselves and drawing close to God. And these techniques appear in all Jewish writings, from the Torah to today's commentaries. So these are two important words, and I've got their root. I haven't put the word itself, but just got the root relating to these two words, which you'll see on the screen. These words are hitbonenut and hitbodedut. These two words are what we could call biblical mindfulness or controlled thought processes. So it starts with isolation, that's hitbodedut, either physically to a physical place where we can be alone with God, or a person can be alone with their God and thoughts, or mentally and spiritually. And I just want to quickly add, this is practiced by Hasidic, the Breslov or something it's called, Breslov in Ukraine, I think, or Russia. And what they do is they take time aside and they just have an open dialogue with God and contemplate God in nature. So they look at the trees in the beautiful green forest that they have, and they just openly share their heart with God. I was just a side note, I was listening to a guy talking about it, and he said, before you can pray a prayer that's like a deep thought, mentally engaging, spiritually engaging prayer, like in the Siddur, and focus on it, if you're upset, if you're sad, if there's something else on your mind, you have to get it off your mind. It's like a relationship when you're doing something with your partner that you and your partner or your close friend normally enjoy, and you're like, hey, what's wrong? And they're like, oh, nothing. And you just know that there's no connection in what you're doing. Just get it off your chest. That's part of this process. And I thought that was really encouraging. Usually Judaism is quite scripted, but here we've got this unscripted time before we go into something quite scripted. So I thought that was very refreshing. Okay.
Yeah, they're the Breslovs you're talking about, Ryan.
Yeah, that's the ones. Yep. They like to wear white.
Yeah.
So ideally, both the physical and spiritual mental isolation will occur. So first, to control what or who we focus on. To do this, you have to quiet the flow of mundane thoughts that constantly flow in and out of your mind. So we call this mind chatter. You know, I don't want to go to work on Monday. What's for dinner? Wonder what's on Netflix, or anything that just randomly, like clouds passing over our head, or cars on the highway. Our attention is grabbed by them and we follow them as they come past, right? So this is the things that cause people with anxiety to feel so compressed in their thoughts, the constant stream of thoughts and things that they can't control, right? They just can't control all these thoughts that come in. So biblically, this is done by contemplating God's wonders in nature and starting an open dialogue with him. That's how you start. You just start talking to God about what you think or you feel. This is important because it helps to separate or isolate our mind from distractions of the flesh or anything, even if it's neutral, something that is outside of what we solely want to focus on, so that we can wholly put our attention on God and his Torah, or in our case, putting on the Messiah. So this requires us to first of all contemplate him in the scriptures as well. So this can be like contemplating him in nature, or contemplating an idea of God, his love, his kindness, his strength, power, a scripture, just repeating it, understanding it. So we're going to build a knowledge base and then transfer that to our minds so we can isolate these thoughts and ideas, these feelings, and get rid of the distractions. Those things that keep us from the full contact with God, right? Then we begin to focus on them and understand them, and then literally engrave them into our mind. So this separation occurs when we are fully able to engage our mind and spirit upon God and Yeshua without being interrupted by these extraneous thoughts which we don't want to focus on. And that's one of the major differences. If you're thinking more like Zen Buddhism, it's like let your mind go and let it be free and focus on the self. But this is like, I solely want to focus on God, so I'm going to block out every single other thought. And that is a biblical pursuit, but it takes time, right? It's not something so easy. So let's have a look at another scripture. According to Hebrews 12:13, and I'll just quickly grab this one. Hang on a sec. Oh, so does someone else want to read that? It's Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3, sorry.
12 verse 3. Yep,
Yeah.
12 verse 3. Yes, you think about him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that you won't grow tired or become despondent.
Thank you. So in the complete Orthodox Jewish translation, they use that word hitbonenut, of which the root word is binah, to understand or discern. So part of this type of meditation that restores our soul is understanding the attributes of Messiah, how he did things, how he lived his life. That will keep us motivated if we keep our eyes on him. All right, so therefore we must meditate and build a knowledge of the life and teachings of Yeshua so we can understand them and incorporate them into our very being. As I said before, this version of meditation means hitbonenut, and it's a reflexive of the root bin, meaning to understand or discern. And it's from this root that we get the word binah, meaning understand, right? That's where we get it from. So hitbonenut literally means making oneself understand. That is contemplating something so deeply and completely that one makes himself understand it in all its aspects and details. Like it's like a scientist who looks not only at the body but at the cell, and then at the cell and the organs of the cell, and then the DNA itself. You know, you completely understand the body, how it works from looking at the cells of the body. That's the kind of contemplation. We're pulling everything apart. We're getting right in there. But at the same time, we enter a different headspace because we're not thinking all these other thoughts that normally occur. So you are shifting gears in the way your brain is acting. So, and as a result, you'll have peace and you'll have maybe a better concentration because you're flexing that muscle in a way that we not sometimes used to. So therefore, we are required, before we serve God anew, to take some time to contemplate the ashes of yesterday, the work we did prior, so we can move on ahead today. We can take time to isolate ourselves from our flesh so we can fully cleave to God through his Messiah before we even start our prayer service. Then we will be ready. Our altar will be clean and prepared to accept a new work upon it. We can separate our flesh by isolating it and putting on Yeshua, our Messiah. We're wholly concentrating our mind and spirit upon him, his character, his very essence, until we not only receive a revelation of him, but become the very revelation of Yeshua embodied in our beings. So this is a bit of a paraphrase, but one of the commentators upon Jewish mindfulness and meditation says this: the goal of Jewish meditation is to grasp the divine and say, when will I be able to make a home for the Shekhinah to dwell in me? That's what part of what we're pondering. How can I improve? How can I make this vessel holy and complete so God can fully embody me? That's part of what we're contemplating here. All right. So, as we've said before, Rabbi Shaul says that we should not be given over to our flesh, right? Romans 13:14. Again, in the Orthodox one, it uses that word hitbonenut. It's really focusing, and I mean, it's only used those 2 times, but it's really focusing on the fact that this type of meditation was, in one form or another, expected by the disciples or practiced, and we were encouraged to engage in it. So therefore, it's a kosher type of meditation we're looking at here. All right, so a simple way to make this a practical element here, and something we can use, is to meditate from the Siddur on the prayer, I hereby join myself to the Master, Yeshua the Messiah. So we can practice that. Like, what does that actually mean? We can read it, but what does that mean to join yourself to him? Have we actually pondered the depth of what that means before we go about our day? Have we taken time to push aside all the thoughts, I've got to go to work, I don't know what doctor I'll be working with today. Are they going to treat me like this? Are they going to be like that? Is it going to be a horrible day where one of the patients crash at work? All those things for me I have to push aside and solely focus on. Doesn't matter what happens, how can I bind myself to Yeshua so that in all those situations, I can role play myself as Yeshua? That's part of that meditation. Today when I go to work, if someone gossips, how will I act as though I'm wearing Yeshua's very person so that it's no longer I, but Christ in me? That's part of this meditation. So let's practice spending time working through what it looks like, what it feels like, so we can put him on, bind ourselves to his person, and then start our daily prayers in the garments of our high priest in the heavenly realm. Shabbat Shalom.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan.
Wow, that was really good, Ryan.
Thank you.
A few things to chat about, I think.
And can I start with,
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
I know what you mean by all those things fluttering through your head, because I know every morning when I try and sit down and do the prayers, especially once you get to know them a little bit, I find so quickly that I'm going through the prayer and yet my mind is thinking about all sorts of other things. And it just takes a little bit, just takes a thought about one line of that prayer that you say, and you're actually thinking about, oh, I've got to do this as a result of what I've prayed. And you've just prayed 3 more lines onwards without even thinking about what you've prayed. So it's so relevant what you're talking about, that we need that, especially in our current day, because we've got so much happening around the world, so many distractions. It's so important. It's good.
I also find it really interesting because so much of my walk has been about how am I a good person in the physical sense? So do I tithe? Am I kind to others? Am I reading the word? But understanding that a lot of what Yeshua was talking about was also mental. So if you think about something in your mind, you've done it. If you are angry about somebody, if you're angry, it's like murdering that person. So understanding that our spiritual walk is as much a physical thing as it is a mind game of, getting our minds straight. And because if our minds, which some people say is our heart, is not straight, then our physical acts don't really matter. They don't have the same weight, they don't have the same impact because our minds and our hearts are not straight. So how do you get your mind and your heart straight? You know, like you may be able to do physical things, but sometimes you do have to address those voices in your head. And sometimes you do have to face your demons and face those things that you have in your head and say, well, I can't think like this. And how do I change my thinking for it to be a holier place, so that, you know, like Ryan said, so that we can house God in a way.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, it's twofold, isn't it?
I mean, the topic deserves a much deeper explanation. I heard one rabbi talking about it, and I shared the video with Daniel because he has more of an understanding with me, and he was talking about 4 or 5 different therapies known by, I guess, the secular world that people use with counseling, and it's a mismatch of a few of those together in its own kind of, I guess, unique formula, but there's such a depth to it. And I think coming from Pentecostalism, where we often are allowed more of that freedom, it's good to say, hey, there's also a bit of unscripted or scripted, bit of freedom to move within. And it's not against having something written like the Siddur, but the two go together.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bit of freedom there.
There is a fence, and there's freedom within that fence. We forget that, you know, we think it's so narrow, but there's actually quite a bit of freedom in that fence.
I like the way that, sorry, my voice is still gravelly. Sorry, everyone. I like the fact that we don't come without focus. We come with binah. We come with understanding. You know, we focus on the attributes of Messiah. We want to clothe ourselves. And, you know, these aren't empty words. You know, you've got to practically clothe yourself in the mindset of Yeshua. If you want to take the ashes of yesterday to carry on that peace and have that fire burning inside of you so that you can be a carrier of the Shekinah. Wow. Do you ever have to have your mind surrendered and purposeful in the way that you dialogue with Messiah and focus in on him? I thought that was really, really good. Very challenging. Yeah.
The hardest part is it's a consistent exercise. In itself is like exercising. It's like Dad said with the Siddur. Someone who lifts 50 kilograms for 6 months, that is going to become very light really soon. Like if you just bench press that, you actually have to push yourself. There's a time when you actually have to push your mind more and more and strengthen it, because it is a muscle. And studies have shown that these types of engaging these thought processes is actually really mentally beneficial.
Of course. Yeah.
So I'm going to use that as a bit of a segue for one of the things that we wanted to share was at the moment we've stopped our Shacharit prayer, just trying to get back into a swing of things with this new way of doing things. But soon we want to start back up on a Shabbat morning, maybe from 11 till 11:45 or something like that, and that gives us a chance to have a break for lunch and then come back at 12:45 at 1 o'clock for the Torah service. But starting at 11 with doing the Shacharit prayer again, but this time we want to, if other people are joining us, we want to do a bit of a tutorial beforehand on how to use the prayer siddur that we got from Rabbi Shapira. So probably at 10:45, we'll do like a 15-minute, here's some steps how to go through. Ryan can share some of his insights into prayer to get our hearts and minds focused in that area. So I really felt that strongly this morning during my prayer time that we have to start implementing prayers again. And look, if you're doing them at home by yourself, you don't want to join in as a group, that's okay, you know. For me, the whole point was that I think Hashem is calling us even more strongly now, especially with everything happening, to a solid prayer life where we're focusing on Him, hearing from Him, and working with Him in what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. What else?
I think I am being challenged also with like the idea that currently I'm trying to, you know, exercise and eat healthy and be healthy physically. And like, you know, people say if you exercise, it's good for your mental health as well and things like that. But I'm currently being challenged in, you know, comparing the amount of time that I put in making sure that I'm physically healthy and how much time I put in making sure that I'm spiritually healthy and mentally healthy as well. And just comparing those times and saying, where does my, not loyalty, but where does my priority lie? And in oftentimes I do fail because I realize that, you know, going day by day in the routine, it's so easy to just pilot through the day and not really think about, like Ryan said, like nature and how God is amazing and how he holds the worlds together. And just in times like this as well, how we're busy talking about how everything is so bad and, you know, we're in isolation, but mentally we're not isolating ourselves to be with God. We're just self-isolating and trying to fill the day with whatever we can. But how much of that physical isolation, how much time are we taking aside to mentally isolate and be with God? Because we have time, we don't have an excuse if we are at home anyway. But yeah, I'm being challenged every day by that at the moment.